Hey friends, tonight's story drifts back to a time when justice was not only public, but often, surprisingly scenic. We're talking about colonial stocks, the simple wooden devices that promised equal parts humiliation, inconvenience, and, depending on your point of view, a free seat in the middle of town. Before you get too comfortable, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of slow, peculiar history. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always enjoy imagining these odd little tales being heard in bedrooms, kitchens, or darkened living rooms all over the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe put on a fan for that soft, steady hum, and let us wander together into a punishment that might not be as dreadful as it first appears. You can imagine it now: two sturdy beams of timber, weathered from rain and sun, set up in the busiest part of the village. The top beam has holes carved for your head and wrists, and the bottom beam matches perfectly, locking in place with a heavy iron hinge and a pin the size of a small carrot. Once inside, you're not going anywhere. People walk by on their way to buy flour or gossip at the tavern, glancing over at you like you're just another feature of the town square, somewhere between the fountain and the notice board. What makes it strange, though, is how still it all is. No running, no scrambling, no last-minute speeches to sway the judge. You're just there, fixed in place like an oddly personal piece of street furniture. Some found this deeply humiliating after all: every creak of the wood, every cough from a passing neighbor, reminded them that their reputation was on display. Others, however, found that after a while the mind drifted. There was nothing to do but look at the clouds, listen to the chatter of the market, and count how many chickens crossed the road that morning. In this way, the stocks were a curious contradiction, half punishment, half accidental meditation session. But make no mistake, the people of the time took them seriously. The town didn't keep them polished and ready just for decoration. They were a symbol, a warning, and a kind of open-air theater, all in one. And for anyone unfortunate enough to be locked inside, it was the slowest possible way to learn the value of following the... You might think the stocks were an American invention, something dreamed up by a small colonial council eager to keep order among unruly settlers. But the truth is, they were an import, much like tea, wool blankets, and that peculiar idea that every town needed at least one man who could play the bagpipes badly. The stocks came across the Atlantic in the cultural luggage of the English, who had been using them for centuries before anyone in New England thought to plant a pumpkin. You can almost picture the early ships arriving, sails snapping in the wind, the holds packed with barrels of salted fish, crates of iron tools, and somewhere tucked between the rope coils and spare planks, a neat set of instructions for building the most reliable device in public humiliation. In England, the stocks had already been part of village life for generations, appearing in the market squares and churchyards of towns that otherwise had very little going on. They were the kind of feature you didn't really notice until you needed them, like a water pump, or a barrel for rainwater, or the one neighbor with a suspiciously large supply of rope. Early American colonists, steeped in this tradition, didn't see the stocks as something cruel or unusual. They saw them as sensible, portable, and easy to assemble. The IKEA furniture of medieval justice, except the instructions didn't come with cheerful cartoons, and the end product had rather fewer uses. There's some debate among historians over exactly when the first set of stocks was set up on American soil. Some suggest the early 1600s in the stern Puritan settlements of Massachusetts Bay, where every misdemeanor from swearing to selling bad bread had a matching penalty. Others argue for the mid-17th century, pointing to records in Virginia and Maryland that mention their construction. And then, of course, there are those historians who shrug entirely, content to note that stocks simply appeared at some point, as if they had been there all along, much like gossip, mosquitoes, and the quiet certainty that your neighbor's cow was better than yours. What we do know is that the colonists saw the stocks as part of an essential civic toolkit. Just as a settlement needed a meeting house, a mill, and a well, it needed a way to deal with the mildly troublesome members of society, not the dangerous criminals. Those people had more serious fates, but the petty troublemakers, the people who owed small debts, spoke out of turn, or wore clothing deemed too fine for their station. In a way, the stocks weren't just a punishment. They were a form of public theater, and the early colonists knew how to stage a show. The journey from old world to new also carried with it the old social expectations. In England, a stint in the stocks wasn't meant to break a person entirely. It was meant to make them an example. You were displayed like a cautionary sign, a living message that certain behaviors would not be tolerated. The public was the real judge, jury, and entertainment committee, and their opinions could be far harsher than any law on the books. The colonists embraced this same logic, perhaps because it required little in the way of resources. A gallows needed skilled carpentry, a prison needed constant upkeep, but the stocks, they could be made in an afternoon with a saw, a few hinges, and a willingness to believe this would improve the moral tone of the settlement. One can almost imagine the first day the stocks were put to use in an American village. Perhaps the townsfolk gathered with the same curiosity they might reserve for a new well or a shipment of goods. There would have been some murmuring about whether the thing looked sturdy enough, a few jokes at the expense of whoever would be first to try it, and an unspoken satisfaction in knowing that the rules of the old country still held, even in this unfamiliar land. For settlers who felt adrift in the wilderness, recreating the legal customs of home must have been oddly comforting. A sign that no matter how far they'd sailed, the village square could still feel like the village square. Of course, the Atlantic crossing had a way of transforming traditions, and the stocks were no exception. In England, they were often placed near churches, the moral and social heart of the community. In the colonies, they might be set up by the market, at the crossroads, or in front of the meeting house, wherever they would attract the most passing eyes. And while the English sometimes used them for hours at a time, the colonists occasionally left offenders in place for entire days, or even overnight, adding a level of endurance testing that wasn't always part of the original plan. Some historians suggest this was simply a result of smaller communities having fewer distractions. If the most interesting thing happening on a Tuesday was a man stuck in the stocks, why not keep the entertainment going? There's also the matter of climate. The stocks in England were generally used in a relatively mild, if damp, environment. In the American colonies, the seasonal extremes could be far more dramatic. A person locked in place under a blazing July sun, or during a biting January wind, experienced a version of the punishment that old-world villagers might never have imagined. This, too, may have shaped the colonial attitude toward the stocks. They were not merely symbolic. They could be uncomfortably, even dangerously, real. Yet for all these adaptations, the essence remained the same. The stocks were a holdover, a reminder that justice, in the eyes of the community, was best served where everyone could see it. They were a bridge between continents, a tangible link between the lives people had left behind and the new world they were trying to shape. And, perhaps, most importantly, they required no complicated legal system to operate. A simple decree from the local authorities, a willing carpenter, and an available patch of ground were all it took to transform an empty space into a stage for moral instruction. So the next time you picture an American colonial town, don't forget to include the stocks. They may not feature in the grand paintings of history, tucked away as they are behind the more dramatic stories of revolution and exploration. But they stood there, sturdy and unblinking, quietly reminding everyone that some parts of life, the rules, the punishments, the small public shames, were simply too useful to leave behind. You find yourself standing in the quiet main square of a colonial settlement, and before you, under the shade of a large elm tree, stands the unmistakable silhouette of the town's stocks. At first glance, they seem simple, just two thick planks of timber, hinged together with large iron fittings. But as you draw closer, you see that their design is not simply decorative. It is precision discomfort. The wood is heavy, often oak or another hardwood that could withstand years of use, weather, and the occasional angry goat that decided to nibble the edges. The upper beam, carved with 3 neat semicircles, 1 for your head and 2 for your wrists, looks almost polite in its symmetry, but the moment you imagine leaning forward into it, you realize there's nothing polite about the experience. The angles are just off enough to keep your muscles gently protesting for as long as you're inside. Carpenters at the time didn't approach stocks with the same care they might give a fine writing desk. Smoothness was not the priority here. These boards were cut to be functional, sturdy, and slightly unforgiving. The wood was rarely polished. Instead, it was left rough to stand up to rain and mud. Over the years, the grain would warp slightly from weather, meaning the fit wasn't always perfect. A head hole that was round enough for your neighbor might press awkwardly into your own neck, and a wrist slot could pinch the tender part of your skin no matter how you shifted. You didn't have the luxury of adjusting either. The moment the top board came down and the iron lock clicked shut, you were as fixed as a portrait in a frame. The locks themselves were a matter of civic pride. Heavy iron padlocks, sometimes engraved with the blacksmith's mark, kept the beam in place. If you were lucky, the hinges were greased. If not, you might hear a drawn-out creak as they closed you in, a sound that made even the bravest offenders swallow hard. And while the metalwork was undeniably solid, it wasn't meant for elegance, just reliability. After all, you wouldn't want an embarrassing situation where someone slipped out of the stocks and ran away mid-sentence during the town crier's announcement of their crime. The placement of the stocks was equally deliberate. Most towns positioned them in open, central spaces where the ground was slightly uneven, ensuring that you couldn't find an easy footing. Even if your legs were free to move, they'd be shifting on gravel, cobblestones, or packed dirt, making every minor adjustment an exercise in balance. And the height of the structure was just enough to make bending your knees for relief an awkward, limited affair. You could shift weight from one foot to the other, but there was no comfortable stance. Scholars debate whether this was a product of design efficiency or just an accidental outcome of building stocks at whatever height the local carpenter found easiest. Still, the effect was the same, a slow-building stiffness that made every minute feel longer than the one before. Of course, colonial builders didn't invent the concept. Stocks had been around for centuries in England, where they were just as effective in holding both peasants and occasional noblemen in place. But in the New World, the design took on local adjustments. Some towns added small wooden footrests, ironically meant to reduce fatigue, but often positioned at angles that just made things worse. Others incorporated a low bench, allowing the offender to sit, though sit here meant perching at a tilt, with your back curved and your weight resting heavily on your wrists. It was a version of comfort that felt more like a prank. If you were to run your hands over the surface, you'd find dents, scratches, and perhaps initials carved by previous occupants. Little rebellions left behind in the hours when nothing else could be done. Some marks were neat, others rushed, scratched deep by someone's thumbnail or the sharp edge of a ring. In rainy seasons, the wood might swell slightly, making the holes tighter and the release more of a struggle for the constable. In summer, the heat would warm the beams, sometimes leaving faint patterns of sweat and suntan lines across the skin of those unlucky enough to spend the afternoon there. And yet, for all this awkwardness, the stocks were considered a practical, even humane punishment. They didn't draw blood, and they didn't break bones. They simply held you still, very still, for as long as the magistrate decided was appropriate. That stillness, combined with the inability to hide your face, was perhaps the most punishing element. People could walk right up to you, examine your expression, and decide whether to offer sympathy, mockery, or a handful of overripe vegetables. All of it was made possible by a device that, from a distance, looked deceptively simple. You notice, too, the way the stock's design creates an unspoken hierarchy. The beam is at just the right height for passers-by to look down at you, even if they're children. This wasn't an accident. Humiliation works better when the offender is physically lower in the social and literal landscape. From this vantage point, you're no longer the tailor, the baker, or the man who argued with the town constable. You're simply the person in the stocks, on display, reduced to a single bad decision and a wooden frame. As the day stretches on in your imagination, you can feel the gentle ache in your shoulders from the forward lean, the way your wrists slowly throb from being held in one position. There's no cushion, no padding, nothing to make this easier. And yet, compared to other punishments of the era, whippings, branding, or worse, this still feels almost merciful. Almost you can stand here, endure the gawking, and when your time is done, walk away more or less intact, if a little stiff. It is punishment by inconvenience, and that inconvenience is built into every joint, every angle, every unpolished inch of wood. By the time you've taken in every detail, the weathered boards, the solid hinges, the lock that clicks like finality itself, you realize the genius of the design lies not in cruelty but in control. The stocks are not meant to hurt you quickly. They are meant to hold you, to keep you in place while the rest of the town moves freely around you. And perhaps that is the most powerful punishment of all. The reminder, hour by hour, that you are fixed in one spot while life goes on without you. You find yourself still fixed in the stocks, the rough wooden boards pressing firmly around your ankles and wrists, your body held awkwardly in place. As you stand there, unable to move, your mind drifts to the many small reasons that people like you ended up here. The crimes that brought folks to these public punishments weren't the grand, sweeping acts of rebellion or robbery you might imagine. Instead, they were minor offenses, little breaches of community expectations, the kind of things that in your modern life might barely raise an eyebrow. But here, in this tightly knit colonial settlement, even the smallest misstep could become a very public spectacle. For starters, there was public drunkenness. In a time when drinking was a daily routine for many, being caught drunk and disorderly in a town square was considered a serious nuisance. You might have imagined that the punishment for such behavior would be more severe, but instead you'd be locked into the stocks, made to endure the curious and sometimes mocking gazes of your neighbors. The logic was simple. You didn't need to be beaten or branded to learn your lesson. Just the embarrassment of being on display was enough. Swearing or using offensive language was another common reason to find yourself in this uncomfortable contraption. The colonists, many of whom were devoutly religious, had little patience for blasphemy or foul talk, especially when it happened in public places where children might overhear. The stocks acted as a kind of moral spotlight, a way to remind everyone that words had consequences, and that respect for community standards was expected. Petty theft was also on the menu of crimes punished by the stocks. Stealing a loaf of bread or a chicken might not seem like a grand crime today, but in a settlement where every resource was precious, it was taken seriously. Rather than harshly punishing these offenders with corporal punishment or imprisonment, the stocks offered a middle ground, a way to shame the offender while preserving their physical well-being. Then there were offenses related to social order, things like skipping church services, neglecting community duties, or even dressing inappropriately. Believe it or not, wearing clothing that was considered too fine for your social status could land you in the stocks. in a world obsessed with hierarchy and appearances. Stepping out of line in your attire was more than just a fashion faux pas. It was a challenge to the community's sense of order. You might be surprised to learn that even children weren't exempt. Kids who misbehaved, caused disturbances, or disrespected adults could find themselves locked in the stocks as a form of discipline. Imagine being a young child, surrounded by adults who were either amused or disapproving, trapped in wood that didn't care if you cried or squirmed. It was a harsh lesson in obedience and public humility. One documented colonial legal code, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties from the 1640s, specifically listed behaviors that could earn you a spot in the stocks: drunkenness, lying, swearing, cursing, and other disorderly conduct. It was a way to keep the peace without resorting to more violent punishments, balancing community order with a certain sense of restraint. Historians still debate the true purpose behind these punishments. Was it primarily about shaming the individual, or was it more about reinforcing community values through shared experience? Some argue that the public nature of the stocks created a collective consciousness. Everyone learned what was acceptable and what wasn't by watching and participating in these small acts of discipline. Others suggest that it was simply a practical way to deal with minor offenses in small, resource-limited communities. Interestingly, the exact crimes punished by the stocks varied from town to town. What earned one person a few hours in public humiliation in Massachusetts might lead to a fine or whipping in Virginia. Local customs, the temperament of the magistrate, and even the season could influence how the punishment was administered. For instance, a harsher winter might discourage long stays in the stocks, while a warm summer day might invite more prolonged exposure. So, as you imagine yourself here, trapped but conscious, consider all the small ways people stumbled into this predicament. A careless word, a stolen apple, a missed church service. The stocks were less about punishing evil deeds and more about managing everyday social order. And as the townsfolk passed by, some shaking their heads, others chuckling quietly, you realize that being in the stocks was not just a punishment. It was a lesson written in wood and public gaze. You stand there, locked firmly in the stocks, the rough wood pressing into your skin, your head bobbing slightly as people begin to gather. What surprises you most isn't just the discomfort of being immobilized. It's the crowd that slowly forms, like moths drawn to a flickering candle in the quiet village square. In small colonial towns, stocks weren't just a punishment. They were the social event of the day, a kind of communal theater where everyone played a part. The offense might have been minor, but the spectacle, that was everything. Imagine the market day, the hubbub of stalls selling everything from fresh eggs to handmade pottery, and the sudden shift in attention as the townsfolk divert their gaze to you. The baker stops kneading dough, the blacksmith lowers his hammer, and even the children, who might have been chasing one another through the dirt lanes moments ago, now form a curious semicircle. Being in the stocks meant you became the main attraction. your awkward posture and inability to escape drawing a mixture of sympathy, amusement, and sometimes cruel delight. The public nature of the stocks served several purposes. For one, it was a warning to others. If you saw your neighbor locked into that wooden frame for swearing or stealing, it reminded you that the rules of the community were real and enforced. There was also an element of social bonding. Shared laughter at a minor offender's expense was one of the ways the townsfolk reinforced their collective identity. You could almost hear the unspoken message: we're all in this together, and if you step out of line, you'll be seen. The very design of the stocks encouraged this performance. Positioned prominently in the town square or near the meeting house, they were impossible to ignore. Passers-by could lean in to sneer, whisper gossip, or sometimes offer a small token of pity. A slice of bread, a friendly nod, or even a whispered word of encouragement. The stocks were less about isolation and more about exposure. You weren't just punished, you were put on display. This level of public scrutiny could be far more effective than a fine or a private reprimand. One quirky tidbit about this social spectacle is that market days often saw the stocks used strategically. Local authorities would time the punishment to coincide with days when the most people would be around. This wasn't just efficiency, it was showmanship. The longer your time in the stocks overlapped with the town's busiest hours, the stronger the message sent to the community. You might be there for an hour, or for an entire market day, turning you into a living billboard of cautionary behavior. Historians still argue whether this public shaming was more about justice or entertainment. Some suggest that it created a sense of order and deterrence by making punishments visible, while others think it bordered on cruelty, turning human suffering into a kind of spectacle that fed the townsfolk's curiosity and, sometimes, their cruelty. Either way, it was an unmissable part of town life, a slow-moving drama that unfolded under the open sky. Children were often the most relentless audience. Far from being mere passive observers, they would heckle, tease, and sometimes throw small objects at the unfortunate person locked in place. For them, it was a game, a break from the dull routines of colonial life. Adults sometimes joined in, although usually with a more restrained sense of humor. You might even find the occasional sympathetic bystander who, remembering their own day in the stocks, offered a kind word or a helping hand once the punishment was over. Despite the humiliation, there was a strange camaraderie among those who had been there before you. The stocks became a kind of rite of passage for minor offenders, a shared experience that connected them to the community in a curious way. You weren't just isolated punishment. You were part of the town's ongoing story, a momentary character in a long-running play. As you imagine this bustling scene, the smells of fresh bread mixing with the sharp tang of iron tools, the murmur of conversations interrupted by bursts of laughter or whispers, you realize that the stocks, for all their discomfort, played a vital social role. They were a place where justice met spectacle, where punishment became performance, and where the community's eyes never wavered. You stand trapped in the stocks, the wooden boards biting gently into your wrists and ankles. while the bustling market day unfolds around you like a slow-moving river of life and chatter. The market is the heartbeat of the colonial town. Stalls piled high with fresh produce, bundles of wool, handmade tools, and gossip that travels faster than the pigeons overhead. And right here, right now, you are the centerpiece of the day's main attraction. Market days were no accident when it came to public punishments like the stocks. The local magistrates and town officials, whether by careful planning or simple practicality, timed the use of stocks to coincide with these gatherings when the town was fullest of people. It wasn't just about making sure you served your sentence. It was about making sure everyone else saw it, learned from it, and maybe had a little entertainment while they were at it. After all, in a small town with few diversions, the stocks were one of the more reliable ways to draw a crowd. The sun beats down steadily as you endure the mix of curious stares, whispered judgments, and the occasional snicker from passers-by. You try shifting your weight, but the awkward angles make it a slow, stiff process. The smell of fresh bread and roasting meat mingles with less pleasant odors. The livestock penned nearby, the damp earth underfoot, and the inevitable wafts from the less hygienic parts of town. All of this combines into a sensory overload that's oddly disorienting, while your body remains locked in place. One historical fact to consider. Market days in colonial towns were often the social calendar's most important event, attracting not just locals, but traders and visitors from neighboring settlements. They were places of exchange, not only for goods, but for news, disputes, and yes, public punishments. Records show that some towns deliberately scheduled punishments like stocks and pillories during market days to maximize their visibility. It wasn't just about visibility, though. The market crowd often brought out a particular type of humiliation unique to these days. With so many eyes watching, it wasn't unusual for the townsfolk, especially the younger and more mischievous members, to participate in snack attacks. These involved tossing rotten vegetables, stale bread, or even the occasional live critter your way. While it might seem cruel, it was part of the ritual, a way for the community to collectively express disapproval and remind you of your place. Yet, among the jeers and occasional peltings, there were moments of unexpected kindness. A vendor might quietly slip a piece of fresh fruit into your hand, or murmur a word of sympathy as they passed. Sometimes a friend or family member stood nearby, offering reassurance through their steady gaze, or whispered promises of support once your time was up. This delicate balance between humiliation and compassion made the punishment bearable, if only just. Scholars still argue about the real impact of market day punishments. Did they truly deter misbehavior, or did they reinforce social hierarchies and communal bonds in a way that modern justice systems can't quite grasp? Some suggest that these public displays strengthened the community's shared values by reminding everyone of their collective power and the importance of conformity. Others contend that the spectacle simply masked deeper social tensions, using humiliation as a tool to control rather than reform. Pause, you stand, immobilized. The marketplace hums on around you. the calls of merchants hawking their wares, the clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the laughter of children darting between stalls. You are frozen in time, a living monument to the town's sense of order, your punishment both a personal trial and a public lesson. The day drags on, sun moving across the sky, shadows shifting slowly across your confined form. When at last the appointed time passes, and the stocks are unlocked with a satisfying creak, you feel a rush of relief, your muscles stiff and aching. You step free into a world that has moved on without you. The market crowd disperses, their attention drawn elsewhere, but the memory lingers. A reminder that in this town, justice wasn't just about laws, it was about shared experience, public spectacle, and the delicate dance between punishment and community. You might think that being locked into a wooden frame, wrists and ankles restrained, would be pure agony, and in many ways it was. But as you linger here, you begin to notice something curious about the stocks. Despite the awkward angles and the unyielding wood, there was a strange argument made by some colonial observers that, under certain circumstances, the stocks could actually be, well, somewhat comfortable. Now, before you start imagining a cushioned throne or a spa day disguised as punishment, hold on. The comfort in question wasn't luxury by any stretch, but a slow, sedentary rest that came from being forced to stay still. Compared to other punishments of the time, like the lash, the whipping post, or even a stint in the cold jail, the stocks offered a peculiar kind of respite. You didn't have to walk anywhere. You weren't exposed to the lash, and once locked in, you could just be. Some colonial writers even described the stocks as a place where you could, paradoxically, catch your breath, rest your aching feet, and think. If you could bear the humiliation and the passing crowd. The immobilization meant no physical exertion, which for some weary townsfolk, especially the elderly or those recovering from illness, might have offered an involuntary but welcome pause. A mainstream historical fact in several English and colonial town records. There are reports of offenders who claimed the stocks allowed them to rest sore muscles or recover from minor ailments during their sentence. This led to debates at the time about whether the punishment was truly painful or more of a social inconvenience. One quirky tidbit is that some stocks were even modified to include small wooden benches or footrests, presumably to reduce the strain on the legs. Ironically, these comfort features sometimes made the punishment more bearable, which upset some magistrates who worried that the stocks were losing their deterrent power. You can almost imagine a constable grumbling over his morning coffee, lamenting that the new benches make it too easy for the sinners to endure their penance. Historians still argue about how seriously to take these accounts of comfort. Was this an early form of humane punishment, or just a side effect of an otherwise crude system? Some scholars suggest that the stocks' design evolved not only from practicality, but also from a tacit understanding that total misery might not always be the most effective way to enforce social order. Others argue that any perceived comfort was incidental, and that the true punishment lay in the social humiliation and helplessness imposed on the offender. As you remain locked in place, You notice how your body slowly adapts to the immobility. The initial stiffness begins to settle, and the rough wood, while still pressing into your skin, becomes a steady, familiar presence. You find your breathing slows, your mind wanders, and the world moves past you in a gentle, endless flow. It's a strange limbo, part punishment, part forced meditation. Of course, this is not to say the stocks were enjoyable. The immobility brought its own discomforts, numbness creeping into your limbs, muscles protesting the unnatural posture, and the constant awareness of your vulnerability to the jeers and stares of the townsfolk. But in those quieter moments, when the crowd thinned and the sun dipped low, the stocks might have offered a peculiar kind of stillness, a pause from the endless demands of colonial life. So, next time you imagine the stocks, don't just think of harsh punishment and public shaming. Remember that, paradoxically, for some, this wooden cage was also an unexpected place of rest, however reluctant and awkward. A place where time slowed, bodies ached, but minds wandered, and the community's gaze both punished and, in a curious way, preserved. You're still there in the stocks, the sun beating down or the cold wind biting, and suddenly the reality of the weather hits you like a slow, unwelcome visitor. Being locked in place means you can't seek shelter or adjust your position to catch a breeze or avoid the sun's glare. The weather, in all its moods, becomes a relentless companion to your punishment. Imagine a bright summer day, the sun high and unforgiving. The wooden stocks, already warm from hours in the sun, radiate heat against your skin. Your exposed face and arms start to redden as the sun burns gently, then more insistently, reminding you of every minute you've spent immobile. You try to shield your eyes with your hand, but your wrists are trapped in their slots, leaving you helpless against the glare. Around you, the town bustles, unaware or unbothered by your growing discomfort. The sun's slow assault is a punishment in itself. Picture a chilly autumn morning, with the wind slicing through your thin colonial garb. The cold seeps into your bones as you stand frozen, unable to huddle for warmth or seek the comfort of a fire. You shiver, teeth chattering slightly, muscles tensing against the cold, each breath visible in the crisp air. The stones beneath your feet are slick with frost, and your skin prickles with the cold's slow creep. There's no way to escape it. The weather and the punishment work in tandem. Historical records reveal that colonial authorities were well aware of the weather's role in the stocks' punishment. Some towns even set rules about how long an offender could be left in the stocks during extreme weather. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. On some occasions, people endured storms, rain soaking their clothes and chilling them to the bone. On others, a sudden heat wave made the wooden beams unbearable. The weather was an unpredictable, uncontrollable part of the sentence, and that unpredictability added another layer of hardship. A quirky tidbit. In some cases, townsfolk would bring umbrellas or canopies to shade or shield the prisoner, either out of kindness or to make the punishment more bearable for everyone present. In other towns, though, such attempts were discouraged, as the point was to expose offenders fully to the elements, rain, sun, wind, and snow alike. You can almost imagine the debate at the town meeting. Should we be merciful with shade, or keep the stocks true to their cruel purpose? Historians still argue whether exposure to the elements was an intentional part of the stock's cruelty, or simply a side effect of their outdoor placement. Some suggest that the design of colonial towns, with their open squares and limited shelter, made it impossible to protect offenders from the weather without undermining the public spectacle. Others believe that enduring the weather was a deliberate extension of the punishment, a test of endurance and public humiliation rolled into one. As you stand, locked and weathered, you feel every drop of rain, every ray of sun, every gust of wind. The natural world becomes your unyielding jailer, reminding you that punishment isn't just about human judgment. It's also about enduring the slow, patient forces of nature. And so, the stocks, immovable as they are, place you not just at the mercy of the community, but of the weather itself, turning every moment into a quiet test of endurance. You stand trapped in the stocks, the sun beating down on your head, and the rough wooden frame pressing into your wrists and ankles. It's bad enough being locked in place, exposed to the curious eyes of the townsfolk. But now there's something else you need to endure. The snacks. Yes, snacks, but not the kind you'd want to eat. Instead, these are the offerings hurled your way by the crowd mostly. The local children who see your predicament as an opportunity for some impromptu target practice. Imagine bits of stale bread, half-rotten fruit, and squishy vegetables flying through the air with surprising accuracy. You flinch as a tomato splatters against the side of the stocks, its juice dripping slowly down the wood. The smell quickly changes from fresh food to something far less appetizing. As the day goes on and the sun bakes your unwanted garnish, the townspeople's amusement at this spectacle is palpable. These snack attacks are a ritual, a messy and noisy way to express disapproval and reinforce social boundaries. Historically, records from colonial towns describe these snack attacks as common during stocks punishments. The act was not merely cruelty, but a social signal, a way for the community to collectively shun the offender while participating in a communal event. The throwing of food became a symbolic gesture, reminder that breaking the rules wasn't just a legal offense, but a breach of the social contract. A quirky tidbit is that certain foods were banned from being thrown to prevent serious injury. For example, fresh eggs, stones, or anything too heavy were off limits, lest the punishment become physically harmful rather than just humiliating. Instead, townsfolk relied on mushy or less dangerous items, creating a messy but relatively harmless bombardment. Historians still debate the role of these snack attacks. Some argue they were a form of community catharsis, allowing townspeople to vent frustrations and reinforce norms through shared action. Others believe the practice bordered on bullying, turning punishment into public humiliation that may have fostered resentment rather than reform. As you stand immobilized, covered in squashed fruit and rotten bits, The sensation is humiliating, but oddly communal. The laughter and chatter of the crowd surround you, weaving a tapestry of social judgment. This messy ritual, unpleasant as it is, binds the town together, making you both a victim and an unwitting participant in the complex dance of colonial justice. You stand locked in the stocks, the wood rough against your skin, your body unable to move as the town's sensory world envelops you completely. The smells and sounds of the public square settle around you like an invisible cloak, both comforting in their familiarity and deeply unsettling in their intensity. There's no escaping them when you're trapped here. Every whiff, every murmur, every bark becomes a part of your punishment. The scents are a curious mixture. The sweet aroma of fresh baked bread from the nearby bakery mingles with the pungent temps of livestock penned just a few feet away. You catch the faintest hint of smoke from a hearth fire, the acrid smell of burnt wood drifting lazily on the breeze. But there are also less pleasant odors. The sour stench of discarded fish guts dumped near the marketplace, the earthy musk of damp straw, and, if the wind shifts just so, the unmistakable smell of waste from the privy not far off. This olfactory overload adds a layer of discomfort that you hadn't fully appreciated until now. Your nose twitches involuntarily at the more offensive smells, making it harder to breathe easily as you remain trapped. You might try to close your eyes to retreat from the sensory assault, but the sounds keep you tethered to the present. There's the constant murmur of conversation, neighbors exchanging news, merchants calling out their wares, children's laughter echoing between buildings. Occasionally, a dog barks sharply, or the clatter of a dropped basket punctuates the ambient noise. The cacophony blends into a background hum that never quite lets you forget where you are, even when you long for silence. A historical fact. Records show that offenders in the stocks often complained about the unbearable smells and noises as much as the physical restraint. These sensory elements became part of the punishment's power, amplifying the feelings of vulnerability and helplessness. Some towns even placed the stocks near latrines deliberately, adding an extra dimension of discomfort. A quirky tidbit is that some pranksters would take advantage of the offender's predicament by tossing smelly or noisy items. A rotten egg here, a handful of dried beans there, just to heighten the sensory misery. While these acts could be mildly amusing for the crowd, they made the prisoner's time in the stocks a slow, noisy ordeal. Historians still debate how much of this sensory punishment was intentional. Was placing stocks near unpleasant smells a calculated part of the sentence, or simply a convenient spot in the town square? Some argue that the sensory overload was an unofficial but effective layer of public humiliation, while others think it was more accidental, a byproduct of urban design and practicality. As you stand immobilized, your senses bombarded, you understand that punishment here isn't just physical, but deeply psychological. The smells cling to your clothes and skin, the sounds echo in your ears, and the community's gaze weighs heavily on you. It's a reminder that in the stocks, Suffering is not only in being still, but in being acutely aware of every uncomfortable detail around you. You find yourself trapped in the stocks, a wooden frame holding your wrists and ankles tightly in place, and among all the faces staring. It's the children who become the loudest, most relentless presence. Their eyes sparkle with mischief, their voices ringing out like little bells sharp, teasing and full of energy. To them, you are not just a punished offender, but a source of endless amusement, a target for jokes and jeers that seem to bounce off the cobblestones and echo through the town square. You try to hold still, resisting the urge to flinch or glare, but their youthful enthusiasm is impossible to ignore. The children shout rhymes and sing songs, inventing nicknames that stick to you like a second skin. They mimic your awkward posture, making exaggerated gestures that bring laughter from the crowd. Their voices swirl around you, a constant, lively soundtrack to your immobility, reminding you that your punishment has turned you into the day's entertainment. In colonial towns, it was well known that children played a special role in the stocks ritual. Historical records describe scenes where parents sometimes tried to quiet their little ones, only to be told that such teasing was part of the punishment. The town accepted the children's heckling as an essential piece of the public spectacle, a way to teach the young what behaviors society found unacceptable. By joining in, children learned early on about social rules, conformity, and the consequences of stepping out of line. A quirky tidbit is that some communities even had informal hecklers' handbooks, a collection of popular taunts and rhymes passed orally from child to child. These rhymes were carefully crafted to mock the offender without causing real harm, filled with playful insults that were part joke, part social lesson. You might hear the same chant echoed year after year, a folk tradition that turned the stocks into a stage for youthful creativity and social commentary. However, historians still debate the effects of this childhood participation. Some scholars argue that the heckling helped children bond and understand their place in the social hierarchy, a form of early socialization wrapped in fun. Others caution that turning a punishment into public humiliation involving children might have deepened the offender's shame and psychological distress, sometimes leaving scars that lingered long after the stocks were unlocked. As you endure their relentless teasing, their laughter feels both like a blade and a bomb. It's sharp enough to sting, cutting through your dignity and privacy. Yet it also reminds you that even in punishment, you are part of the community's living fabric, flawed, fallible, and very much human. Their voices, ringing out clear and unfiltered, keep you rooted in the moment. A reminder that social judgment isn't only passed down from authority, but also echoed through the innocent yet unforgiving eyes of youth. You can almost picture the little faces, wide-eyed and grinning, some with muddy hands clapping, others holding up homemade signs or banging small sticks against the wooden frame. The children don't understand fully the weight of justice or mercy. They only know the power of laughter and the thrill of being part of the crowd. And so You remain their unwilling audience, trapped in the stocks, but very much alive in their stories and songs. Till you remain locked in the stocks, but soon you might wonder what exactly sets the stocks apart from their close cousin, the pillory. Both are wooden devices designed for public humiliation and punishment, yet they carry different shapes, functions, and reputations. Understanding this difference might help you imagine just how your discomfort could have varied depending on which contraption held you captive. The stocks are, at their core, a device for restraining your feet and sometimes your hands too. Imagine sitting or standing with your ankles clamped in wooden holes, your movement limited to a tiny shift here and there, your arms occasionally locked beside you. If the design includes hand slots, this makes walking impossible, but you remain at ground level, face to face with the gawking crowd. The stock's purpose was to immobilize and expose, turning your lower limbs into a spectacle of shame. The pillory, on the other hand, is a bit more severe and theatrical. Picture a wooden framework that holds your head and hands tightly fixed in place, forcing you to stand upright while your face and shoulders are thrust forward for all to see. Your head and hands are locked in holes high enough to keep you off balance and fully exposed. The pillory elevates your humiliation, quite literally, putting your face at eye level with the crowd. It also makes you more vulnerable, your neck and arms trapped and displayed like a living statue. A mainstream historical fact is that pillories were generally reserved for more serious or specific crimes like perjury, blasphemy, or counterfeiting, while stocks were often used for lesser offenses such as drunkenness or petty theft. Both devices existed side by side in colonial towns, sometimes in the same town square, serving as complementary tools for justice. You might even find a combined structure offering both stocks and a pillory in one setup, increasing the potential for embarrassment. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Some pillories were equipped with bells or whistles, devices meant to amplify the spectacle. When the pillory was locked, a raucous bell might ring out, drawing attention to the offender's predicament, signaling to the town that justice was in session. You can almost hear the clang mingling with the crowd's murmur and the occasional heckle, turning punishment into a full sensory event. Historians still debate the exact social impacts of stocks versus pillories. Some suggest that pillories, by displaying the offender's face, intensified personal humiliation and community shaming, while stocks, focusing on the legs and sometimes hands, felt less invasive but still effective. Others argue that the choice between the two reflected societal attitudes toward different crimes and the desired level of punishment. There's also discussion about whether pillories were more dangerous physically, exposing prisoners to injury from both the restraint and the crowd's abuse. As you imagine yourself confined in either device, you notice subtle differences in how your body and mind respond. The stocks let you sit or stand awkwardly, your gaze low, your humiliation simmering quietly as people pass. The pillory thrusts you into the spotlight, forcing you to confront every face, every sneer, every whisper. Both are prisons of shame, but their tones differ. A dull ache of restriction, the other a sharp sting of exposure. In this way, colonial justice tailored punishment not only to crime but to spectacle. Whether your ankles or your head were locked away, the ultimate goal was the same: to remind you and the community of the consequences of stepping out of line. The stocks and pillories, wooden sentinels of order, stood silently in town squares, bearing witness to centuries of human frailty, folly, and sometimes forgiveness. You're still picturing the stocks, those rigid wooden frames that held people captive in town squares. But by the time the 19th century rolls around, you notice a quiet change in how punishment looks and feels. The stocks, once a common and somewhat celebrated tool of justice, start to vanish slowly, fading away from public spaces and common use. Their disappearance is not sudden, it's more like watching the last embers of a dying fire flicker out, leaving behind only memories and scattered ashes. You might wonder why something so iconic, so ingrained in towns and villages for centuries, would suddenly lose favor. Well, the world itself was changing, especially the way society thought about crime, punishment, and the very nature of justice. The age of public shaming was giving way to a new era, one that prized order, dignity, and the idea that punishment might be better served behind closed doors, away from the jeers and stares of the crowd. A mainstream historical fact is that the rise of the penitentiary system played a huge role in this shift. By the late 18th and into the 19th century, new prisons were being built with the intention of rehabilitating offenders, rather than just humiliating them. The idea was to isolate and reform, to let criminals think about their wrongdoings quietly, instead of forcing them to endure the noisy spectacle of public shame. This was part of a larger philosophical movement toward what was called penitence punishment, as a private internal process. You can almost hear the creaking of the old stocks as they're abandoned in dusty corners, replaced by iron bars and stone walls. Townsfolk begin to see public punishments like stocks as archaic relics, more cruel than effective, more embarrassing than instructive. It's a sign of the times. Justice is becoming more clinical, more bureaucratic. The idea that a crowd should gather to throw rotten vegetables or shout insults at someone, immobilized, seems increasingly barbaric and unnecessary. But here's a quirky tidbit for you. Not every town was quick to get rid of their stocks. In some places, these wooden frames were preserved almost like historical monuments, curiosities that reminded people of a rougher, simpler past. Some communities held onto them as symbols of tradition and authority, even as the practical use of stocks faded. You might find a dusty set of stocks standing in a town square today, more for tourists to snap photos with than for any serious punishment. Historians still debate why stocks fell out of favor so definitively. Was it the changing moral landscape driven by Enlightenment ideas of human dignity and rights? Or was it simply practicality, the inconvenience of organizing public punishments, and the economic disruption caused when crowds gathered for hours? There's also discussion about whether the decline reflected a genuine shift in how societies viewed criminals, or if it was more about improving public order and control. Imagine yourself watching the final public punishments, crowds growing smaller, the laughter and heckling less frequent, until one day the stocks stand empty and silent. The wooden frames, once the centerpiece of justice, become symbols of something old-fashioned, even embarrassing. They are replaced by more private, often harsher punishments, behind prison walls where the community's gaze can no longer reach you. There is a strange comfort in this fading of the stocks. No longer are you the center of attention, the subject of mockery and public scorn. Instead, your punishment is carried out quietly, privately, almost invisibly. It's a change that says something deeper about society's evolving sense of justice, mercy, and the value of human dignity. Yet, the stocks' legacy remains. They remind us of a time when justice was as much about spectacle as about law, when punishment was a shared public event and social order was enforced by communal shaming. That wooden frame, weathered by centuries, still holds stories of pain, of laughter, of lessons learned and forgotten. And so, as the stocks fade from fashion, you are left with a paradox. On one hand, the world moves on, seeking more humane and effective ways to deal with crime. On the other, the stocks linger in memory and in the dusty corners of old towns, whispering tales of a justice that was loud, messy, and very public. You step into a quiet, sunlit town square, in a place that takes pride in its colonial history. The wooden stocks stand prominently, their surfaces smooth and well-maintained, a stark contrast to the bustling modern world around them. But something is different now. Instead of being a device of punishment, they serve as a centerpiece for an entirely new kind of experience, modern reenactment, that invites you to glimpse, in a controlled and playful way, what life might have been like centuries ago. The crowd gathers, faces curious and expectant. You see families, tourists, school groups, all eager to witness a performance that breathes life into dusty history books. The guide, dressed in period costume, speaks softly, weaving stories of colonial justice, public shaming, and the peculiar punishments of old. You listen as they describe how townsfolk once gathered to watch offenders locked in the stocks, how children would heckle and throw tomatoes, and how the community shared in the spectacle of discipline. A mainstream historical fact is that living history museums and colonial fairs across the United States and Europe often include stocks in their exhibits to educate visitors about early justice systems. These reenactments aim to balance historical accuracy with sensitivity, offering immersive experiences without inflicting real harm or humiliation. You can almost feel the careful planning behind every detail, the timing of the punishment, the costumes, even the scripted interactions designed to entertain and inform. A quirky tidbit you might notice is that some reenactors have developed unwritten rules of engagement for these performances. For example, volunteers who choose to enter the stocks during events are briefed on how long they will remain imprisoned and how to handle playful snack attacks from the crowd, like soft tomatoes or grapes tossed gently. These light-hearted traditions add humor and warmth, turning what was once a grim sentence into a communal, friendly activity. Historians still debate the educational value of these reenactments. Some praise them for making history tangible and engaging, helping people, especially children, connect emotionally with the past. Others worry that the entertainment aspect risks trivializing the genuine suffering experienced by those who endured public punishment. There's an ongoing conversation about how to balance respect for historical realities with the desire to create enjoyable, accessible experiences. As you watch, you notice the atmosphere is different from the stock's original use. The laughter is gentler, the voices less cruel. Instead of humiliation, there is curiosity, even empathy. The stocks no longer represent shame, but a bridge connecting you to centuries of social order, justice, and communal life. Perhaps you even see someone volunteer to step into the stocks, a visitor willing to experience a taste of history firsthand. They smile nervously, play along with the crowd's teasing, and for a moment become part of the living story. Their brief punishment feels more like a game, a shared joke that invites everyone to reflect on how far justice systems have come. And so the stocks endure, not as tools of suffering, but as instruments of education and connection. They stand as reminders of a world where justice was public and communal, a world now distant but never entirely forgotten. Through these modern reenactments, history whispers its lessons softly, inviting you to listen and learn. You find yourself once again before the wooden stocks, but this time the scene feels different, quieter, almost reverent. The rough-hewn timber, worn smooth by decades or even centuries of use, stands as a silent witness to a long-forgotten practice, a remnant of an age when punishment was as much a public performance as it was a penalty. Instead of feeling the harsh grip of the wooden holes locking your ankles or wrists, you simply trace the weathered grain with your fingers, contemplating how this object transformed over time from a tool of shame to a curious artifact. Back in the day, being locked in the stocks was a very real and uncomfortable ordeal, limbs trapped, your dignity exposed to the jeers and laughter of the crowd. The punishment was designed not just to immobilize, but to humiliate. But now the stocks have been largely stripped of their power to punish. They have become objects of historical curiosity, cherished as physical links to a past where justice was unavoidably public, raw, and communal. In many towns and museums, these wooden frames are preserved with care. They sit quietly in town squares or inside historical displays, inviting visitors to imagine the lives of those who once suffered within their grasp. You see children climbing playfully over the frames, tourists snapping photos, and guides recounting stories with a gentle tone. The stocks have lost their sting. Instead, they offer a tangible connection to history, helping us understand how community and justice once intertwined in ways that seem distant, even foreign, today. A mainstream historical fact to consider is that many stocks were intentionally preserved as artifacts because of their importance in understanding public discipline. Their survival through centuries offers insight into the evolution of legal and social norms. From a time when public humiliation was a key component of punishment to an era increasingly focused on privacy and rehabilitation. Interestingly, the stocks have also taken on a new life in popular culture and tourism. You might find miniature replicas sold as souvenirs, small wooden models that serve as whimsical reminders of the old days. These tiny stocks, harmless and decorative, spark curiosity and sometimes laughter, a far cry from their original purpose. This quirky transformation reflects a broader cultural tendency to sanitize or romanticize aspects of the past that were once harsh and painful. Yet historians continue to debate the implications of this shift from shame to souvenirs. Some argue that preserving and displaying stocks fosters greater awareness of historical justice practices, encouraging reflection on how far society has come. Others worry that turning such painful relics into mere curiosities risks trivializing the very real suffering endured by those punished. Does the charm of a wooden frame distract from the humiliation and pain it once caused? This remains a thoughtful and ongoing conversation among scholars. As you stand there, the stocks seem to embody this complex mixture of justice and spectacle, pain and memory. They remind you that punishment was never just about the individual. It was about community norms and public order, about teaching and enforcing rules in the loud, messy arena of everyday life. The stocks were tools for social control, but they also tell a story about human nature, about how societies choose to punish, shame, and sometimes forgive. You might feel a strange comfort knowing that the stocks no longer hold prisoners, but instead hold stories. Their presence invites you to reflect on how societies evolve, how ideas of justice and punishment transform with time and changing values. They stand as quiet monuments to human frailty and resilience, to the ways people have tried to balance order with mercy. And so, as you walk away from the stocks, you carry with you a sense of closure. The wooden frames may be old and weathered, but their story is very much a liver testament to the strange and sometimes uncomfortable ways justice has been carried out through the ages. The stocks remind you that while punishment can be harsh, it is also part of a larger human story, one that continues to unfold. You are sitting in a wooden chair that is not designed for comfort. The edges are sharp enough to remind you that the world is made of corners, and the back is straight enough to make you feel as though slouching would be a crime. Outside the window, there is a patch of sky the color of cold milk, and the faint sound of wagon wheels on cobblestone drifts into the room. The classroom is still, except for the scratch of quills on paper and the occasional wet sniff from the boy 2 desks over. There is no clock, but you have learned that time moves differently here. It stretches and sags like an old rope, especially when you are waiting for something unpleasant to happen. The teacher's eyes pass over the room like a lighthouse beam. They stop on you, and you know before he says anything that your morning is about to change. Maybe you have been caught gazing at the window instead of your lesson. Maybe your spelling exercise is a small disaster, every letter leaning like a drunk sailor. Or maybe, and this is the most likely reason, you answered a question with too much confidence and entirely the wrong answer. The teacher sighs, the kind of sigh that sounds as if it has been saved up for a while, and sets down his chalk. He walks slowly to the corner, to a small hook on the wall, where something hangs. It is a tall, pointed cone of stiff paper, yellowed with age. Around its base, a strip of twine is tied, so it can be fastened under the chin. On its front, in bold black letters, carefully inked, is a single word, D-U-N-C-E. It is placed on your head with no ceremony, but also no haste. There is no yelling, no grabbing of arms, just the quiet placing of a hat. It is almost gentle, which somehow makes it worse. You are guided to a stool near the front of the room, turned to face the wall, and left there. You are not physically harmed. The dunce cap does not pinch or weigh you down, but it is impossible to forget it is there. You can feel it like a small tent above your head, broadcasting your current social position to everyone behind you. The punishment is simple. You sit, you face the wall, and you do nothing. But it is a doing nothing under watch. You know that every now and then a pair of eyes will flick in your direction, checking to see if you have learned your lesson. The origins of this peculiar device stretch back to the 13th century, to a scholar named John Duns Scotus. He was a philosopher and theologian who believed that a pointed cap could help channel knowledge into the brain, a sort of intellectual funnel. His followers, known as Duns men, wore these pointed hats with pride. But fashions change, and so do reputations. By the 16th century, the name Dunce had shifted from meaning follower of Scotus to meaning slow learner. The pointed cap, once a symbol of learning, became a symbol of its absence. The irony would probably have been lost on most school children wearing it. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the dunce cap was firmly established as a schoolroom punishment in Britain, America, and parts of Europe. It was the sort of discipline that teachers favored when they wanted to make a point without raising a hand. Pain fades quickly, but humiliation, quiet, steady humiliation, tends to linger. The cap's height was deliberate. The taller the point, the more visible it was across the room. It was not meant to be ignored. As you sit there, you become aware of the way the paper smells, faintly musty, like an old cupboard. You notice the texture of the wall in front of you, every nick and uneven patch in the plaster. You hear the soft murmur of lessons continuing without you. The minutes move slowly, each one sliding past with the effort of a reluctant mule. You begin to measure time in the number of times the teacher's chalk taps against the board. The hat does something curious to the mind. At first, you are embarrassed. Then you are annoyed. Then, after a while, you start to drift into a strange state of observation. You notice the small creak of the floorboards when someone shifts their weight. You see a fly landing on the windowsill and cleaning its legs, over and over. You realize the ink stains on the teacher's desk form a pattern that could almost be a map. The dunce cap, in its own way, trains you to be very aware of your surroundings, though probably not in the way the teacher intended. There are stories of children who found ways to make the punishment less punishing. Some would hum very quietly, just enough to keep themselves company. Others would focus on memorizing the sounds of the classroom, the rhythm of writing, the small coughs, the scrape of a chair. There are even accounts of children who wore the cap as if it were a crown, smiling at their classmates and refusing to show shame. These were rare, but they happened, and when they did, it tended to unsettle the teacher more than the child. The dunce cap relied on the cooperation of the group. Its power came from being seen and judged by others. Without an audience, it was just a cone of paper. But in the context of the schoolroom, it became a symbol, not of violence, but of quiet separation. You were not part of the lesson. You were apart from it, marked and displayed. This was your temporary role in the small theater of the classroom. And so, you sit, you wait, you listen to the faint rustle of pages turning. You feel the light on your back shifting as clouds move past the sun. The punishment will end when the teacher decides you have had enough, which might be soon or might not be. There is no clock for you to watch, and perhaps that is the point. In the absence of anything else, you begin to think, maybe about your mistake, maybe about the weather, maybe about nothing at all. The dunce cap is not remembered fondly, but it is remembered vividly. It sits in history as one of the gentlest forms of discipline to leave such a lasting impression. No scars, no bruises, just a long, slow hour in which to consider the tall, pointed shape of regret. And in that hour, you learn that time, when you are doing nothing, can feel very, very full. The stool you are sitting on is not really a stool. It is more of a plank on 3 legs, one slightly shorter than the others, so that every so often it wobbles. The wobble is slow, deliberate, and just enough to make you aware of the instability beneath you. In any other situation, you might shift your weight to even it out, but the rules of your current position are clear. You sit still. The pointed paper crown on your head feels lighter than it did when the teacher first placed it there, though you suspect this is not because it has grown lighter, but because you have become used to the sensation. The corner you are facing has no decorations. It is bare plaster, pale and slightly rough, marked with tiny scratches that might be from years of broom bristles or the occasional bump of a chair leg. Your eyes begin to trace patterns in them. One crack looks a little like the shape of a river delta. Another, a jagged line near the baseboard, might be a map of a country that doesn't exist. This, you realize, will be your entertainment for the foreseeable future. In the schoolroom of the 19th century, corner time was often the main feature of the dunce cap punishment. The idea was to remove you from participation without removing you from view. You are there to be seen, but not heard, and certainly not involved. There is no greater injury than being present in a room where everything is happening without you. The lessons continue. Questions are asked, answers are given, and you hear them all. But you will not be asked to contribute, and in that silence, you begin to notice the weight of being unnecessary. Time in the corner moves differently. In the first 5 minutes, you can still feel the restlessness in your legs, the urge to glance behind you to see who might be watching. In the next 5 minutes, you begin to settle into stillness. And then, somewhere after the first quarter hour, you enter a state that is difficult to name. It is not boredom exactly, though boredom is there. It is more like being wrapped in slow air, aware of every second as it passes, but unable to do anything to change its pace. There are stories from old school records of children spending entire mornings in the corner. One particularly dedicated teacher in rural England kept a boy facing the wall for nearly 4 hours for writing his name in the margins of his copybook. Another account from an American one-room schoolhouse in 1878 describes a girl who spent the entire afternoon in the corner for inattention during geography recitation, though it was later discovered she had been trying to keep warm by the stove. In both cases, the idea was the same. The longer you sat, the more the punishment would seep in, like cold into your bones. But sitting in the corner had an unintended side effect. It made you observant in ways the teacher probably did not intend. You learned the rhythm of the day from sounds alone. The sharp clap of chalk on the board meant the teacher was explaining something new. The scrape of chairs meant someone had been called to the front. The faint shuffle of feet at the doorway meant a visitor had arrived. You could almost navigate the lesson without turning your head, though you never did, because that would be breaking the one unspoken rule. You face forward until told otherwise. The dunce cap itself, being visible over your head, was the constant reminder to others of your status. In fact, its visibility was part of the design. If a teacher simply sent you to the corner without the cap, you might fade from notice. But the tall point ensured that, even over the shoulders of your classmates, your head was marked. You were part of the scenery. A living lesson in what happens when you fail to meet expectations. Sometimes, of course, the punishment failed to achieve the desired effect. Some children, especially those with a natural stubbornness, wore the cap as a badge of honor. They sat with their backs straight, occasionally tilting their heads so the point caught the light. Others stared down the wall with a kind of quiet pride, as though enduring the corner without complaint proved some greater personal strength. In these cases, the teacher was left in the uncomfortable position of realizing the punishment had, somehow, turned into a test of endurance rather than an exercise in shame. But for most, the corner was a slow erosion of spirit. You thought about the lesson you had missed, not because you cared about it, but because thinking about it gave you something to do. You replayed your mistake in your head, the wrong answer, the misspelling, the clumsy sentence, and wondered if it was truly worth the indignity of a pointed hat. Occasionally, you imagined what would happen if you simply stood up and walked out, though you never did. The imagined escape was the only act of rebellion you could manage without moving a muscle. From a scholarly point of view, the dunce cap and its corner time fall into a category historians sometimes call non-corporal discipline. A type of punishment designed to correct behavior without physical harm. It was, in theory, more humane than the cane or the strap. But the emotional discomfort it produced could be sharp in its own quiet way. The corner was a place of enforced invisibility and constant visibility at the same time. You were removed from participation, yet you remained on display. The teacher, for their part, often considered the corner an efficient solution. It required no extra tools beyond the cap, no physical exertion, and could be applied for any length of time. If they were feeling merciful, it might last 15 minutes. If they were feeling strict, it could stretch into an hour or more. And unlike harsher punishments, there was no risk of leaving marks, at least not on the body. The mind, of course, was another matter. By the time your turn in the corner is nearly over, you have gone through several stages of thought. First irritation, then boredom, then a kind of calm. You have memorized the grain of the wooden floorboards. You have traced and retraced the shapes in the plaster until they are as familiar as the lines on your own hand. And when at last the teacher tells you to return to your desk, you feel an odd mixture of relief and reluctance. Relief that you can join the class again, and reluctance because, for all its dullness, the corner had become a small, private world where nothing was expected of you except stillness. In the end, sitting in the corner of eternity was not about the minutes you lost. It was about the slow lesson that time, when measured in your own breath and the faint hum of a quiet room, can stretch into something far larger than it is. The dunce cap made sure you would remember that, not because it hurt, but because it didn't, and because it turned the smallest space in the classroom into the longest place you could be. The thing about wearing the dunce cap is that it is never just about you and the wall you are staring at. It is about everyone else in the room. You are not meant to vanish quietly into your corner. You are meant to remain visible, a fixed point in the classroom landscape, as much a part of the lesson as the chalkboard or the teacher's desk. The tall point of the cap is your beacon, rising above heads so no one forgets you are there. Even if someone tries to ignore you, the angle of their vision will occasionally catch the pale cone in the corner of their eye, and they will remember. Children in the classroom do not all respond the same way. Some glance at you and quickly look away, perhaps afraid that too much attention might bring them the same fate. Others stare openly, studying your posture, the set of your shoulders, the way the paper point sways slightly if you shift your head. And then there are the few who allow themselves a smirk, a quick twitch of amusement at your expense. In a room where discipline is everything, these tiny exchanges are electric, unsanctioned moments of human connection in a place designed to keep children silent and orderly. The spectacle is a strange one because you are both present and absent. Present in that you occupy space and can be seen by everyone. Absent in that you do not speak, do not contribute, and have no influence on what is happening around you. You are, in effect, an exhibit, and like any exhibit, you invite a certain kind of attention, not conversational, but observational. Classmates take note of your stillness, your silence, and the way the hat perches on your head like an exclamation mark at the end of a dull sentence. Teachers understood the value of this arrangement. Educational manuals from the late 1800s occasionally describe the dunce cap as a silent instructor, a visual aid that taught without words. Its lesson was straightforward. This is what happens when you do not obey or apply yourself. No shouting was needed, no repeated warnings. The presence of one silent figure in the room was often enough to keep the rest in line. The public nature of the punishment meant it was not just for you, but for everyone else who might be tempted to follow your example. And yet, for all its intended shame, the dunce cap occasionally created unintended comedy. The paper was prone to bending, so a particularly long session in the corner might result in your tall point slowly leaning to one side like a melting candle. In some classrooms, this provoked muffled giggles from your peers, which the teacher would try to suppress without acknowledging the absurdity. The more serious the teacher tried to be, the funnier it seemed to everyone else, except you, who were painfully aware that your humiliation was now also slightly ridiculous. There is an old account from a Scottish school in 1863, where a boy managed to turn the spectacle into something of a performance. Sent to the corner for inattention, he angled his stool just enough so that each time the teacher's back was turned, he would pull a face at the other pupils. By the end of the lesson, the class was in barely contained hysterics, and the punishment had completely lost its intended moral effect. The teacher eventually banned that particular boy from wearing the cap again, declaring it an encouragement to mischief rather than a deterrent. But for most children, the spectacle was a sobering experience. You could feel the weight of other people's eyes, even when you weren't looking at them. It is one thing to be in trouble privately, to have a quiet word with the teacher or a note sent home. It is quite another to be in trouble publicly for the duration of an entire lesson. Your mistake announced not in words, but in the physical presence of a tall, conical hat. The silence is not truly silent. It hums with awareness, a low current of mutual recognition between you and everyone else in the room. The role of the audience in such punishments cannot be overstated. Without them, the cap loses most of its sting. In fact, some teachers were known to send a child to stand outside the classroom in the hallway with the dunce cap, ensuring that anyone passing by could see. This extended the reach of the spectacle beyond your immediate classmate, making it possible for students from other classes, or even visitors, to witness your sentence. In smaller communities, this meant that word of your corner time could travel home before you did. Still, not all spectators were unkind. There were classmates who, after the lesson, would offer a small word of sympathy, or even a quiet compliment about how well you had endured it. These moments of human warmth were small, but they stood out against the otherwise cold mechanics of the punishment. They reminded you that while the system was designed to isolate you, it could not entirely erase the solidarity that sometimes springs up between those who share the same rigid environment. Historians who study classroom discipline note that the spectacle of silence worked on a psychological level. It harnessed social pressure as a tool of control. The teacher did not need to strike you or raise their voice. The gaze of your peers did the work. This is what made it, in some cases, more effective than harsher measures. You were not merely told you had done wrong. You were made into a living example of it, set apart yet constantly visible. Over time, you learn to inhabit the role. The first few minutes are always the worst, as you adjust to the strange feeling of doing nothing while being watched. But eventually, you settle into a rhythm. You become aware of the audience without reacting to them. The sound of scribbling quills and the occasional cough becomes the backdrop to your stillness. The hat sits lightly on your head, no longer pressing down with the same weight of shame it carried at first. By the end of your sentence, you may even have forgotten about the audience entirely, until you turn around and see the quiet curiosity in their faces. And then it is over. The teacher removes the hat, places it back on its hook, and waves you toward your desk. The spectacle dissolves. The audience returns to their work, and the room resumes its ordinary rhythm. But you are aware that for the rest of the day, perhaps even the rest of the week, people will remember seeing you there. The image of you in the corner, silent and still under that pointed crown, will linger in the edges of their minds, a reminder of the unspoken rules that keep the classroom machine running. You might imagine that wearing the dunce cap would be the end of any hope for dignity, but sometimes it became something quite different. Instead of a symbol of shame, the hat could transform into a strange kind of badge, a quiet, pointed crown worn by those who refused to let the punishment define them. At first, the feeling is the same as always. The hat settles lightly on your head, the letters D, U, and C staring out like a label you cannot erase. Your classmates glance over, whispering behind their hands or casting smirks your way. The teacher's eyes are sharp, expecting submission. But something inside you stiffens. Instead of bowing to the embarrassment, you decide to own it. You sit up straighter. You hold your chin high, as if the hat was a medal awarded for bravery rather than a mark of failure. There are recorded stories from classrooms across Britain and America where children turned the dunce cap into a tool of defiance. One boy in Victorian England reportedly wore the cap for an entire day, ignoring the teacher's repeated orders to remove it. He walked through the school halls with the paper point proudly perched, refusing to give the punishment its intended effect. His classmates began calling him the Dunce King, a title that, while mocking, also carried a certain respect. In a small New England schoolhouse in 1871, a girl sent to the corner for talking back spent her time sketching tiny crowns on the inside of the hat. When asked why, she said it was her crown of stubbornness. These quiet acts of rebellion were subtle but powerful, ways to reclaim agency in a situation designed to take it away. The hat's shape, after all, is unusual. Tall and pointed, it naturally draws the eye upward, making you taller than you actually are. In the rigid environment of the schoolroom, this physical height becomes symbolic. It turns the wearer into a figure that is hard to ignore, not just because they are punished, but because they stand out. And standing out, even in punishment, can be a source of strength. You learn, over time, that the punishment only works if you allow it to. By holding your posture and refusing to show shame, you chip away at its power. You make it less a sentence and more a statement. Your classmates might still whisper, but now there is a hint of admiration mixed in. The teacher might frown, but the effectiveness of the Dunce cap is undermined. The psychology of punishment is complex. Scholars today suggest that any disciplinary measure relies as much on the reaction of the punished as on the act itself. When a punishment like the Dunce cap is met with quiet defiance, its meaning shifts. It no longer carries only humiliation, but also a strange kind of respect for endurance and individuality. Sometimes this led to a kind of unspoken truce. Teachers, realizing that their tool of shame was losing its edge, might use it less frequently or for shorter periods. They would watch closely for signs that the punishment was no longer effective and adapt accordingly. After all, discipline is a conversation, not a one-way command. From your place in the corner, you might even notice subtle exchanges between teacher and students. A wink here, a suppressed smile there. Small moments that hint at the complicated relationship behind the scenes. The dunce cap was a symbol, yes, but it was also part of a social dance, a game of power and resistance played out in silence. And so, the hat becomes more than a punishment. It becomes a canvas for the wearer's attitude toward authority. Worn with meekness, it is humiliation. Worn with pride, it is quiet rebellion. Worn with boredom, it becomes almost invisible, a paper crown that loses its sting through sheer indifference. By the end of your time with the dunce cap, you might find that you have learned more about yourself than about your lesson. You have learned how the smallest objects, like a cone of paper, can hold enormous meaning. How silence can be both a weapon and a shield. How standing still can sometimes be the most defiant thing you do. The dunce cap's legacy is complicated. It lives in memories and stories, sometimes as a cautionary tale, sometimes as a quirky footnote in educational history. But for those who wore it stubbornly, it was never just punishment. It was a challenge, one you could meet on your own terms, in your own quiet way. You sit quietly as the last echoes of the day fade from the schoolroom. The walls, once alive with chatter and the scratch of quills, grow still. The teacher's hat hangs empty on its hook in the corner. The word dunce, staring back at the silent room like a relic of a bygone age. Over time, the dunce cap itself began to slip from use, fading slowly into history's attic, where forgotten objects gather dust and stories settle like cobwebs. The reasons for its disappearance are many, and none of them particularly dramatic. Changes in educational philosophy, a growing distaste for public humiliation, and new ideas about child psychology all played their parts. By the early 20th century, the dunce cap was increasingly seen as outdated, ineffective, or even cruel. Schools sought kinder, gentler ways to encourage learning, ways that aimed to build confidence rather than chip it away. But the dunce cap never fully disappeared from memory. It remained, for a time, a powerful symbol of an older, stricter era. Its image persists in cartoons, in stories passed down, and in the odd antique classroom museum. It reminds us of a time when punishment was about more than correcting mistakes. It was about marking difference and managing behavior through shame rather than injury. You might wonder what it felt like for those who wore the hat for the last time. Did they sigh in relief? Did they long for the simplicity of a punishment that was over quickly and clearly? Or did they perhaps miss the strange comfort of knowing exactly where they stood, even if it was in a corner under a pointed paper crown? Historians sometimes debate the value of punishments like the dunce cap. Some argue it was a mild form of discipline compared to caning or flogging. Others point out that its effects on a child's self-esteem and long-term relationship with learning could be deeply damaging. The truth, as with many things, lies somewhere in between. The dunce cap was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply a product of its time, a time when discipline was less about empathy and more about order. You think back to the hours spent facing the wall, the weight of the hat on your head, the slow passage of time measured only by your own breath, and the faint sounds of a classroom moving on without you. You realize that the dunce cap story is not just about punishment. It is about how societies have struggled to balance correction with care, control with kindness, and so the dunce cap rests now, quietly waiting in history's attic, alongside other curious artifacts of human behavior. It reminds us that punishment, even when gentle, leaves marks, not on the body, but on memory, identity, and the slow shaping of character. As you lay your head down tonight, perhaps you will picture that tall, pointed hat not as a symbol of shame, but as a reminder of how even the smallest punishments can hold a world of meaning. How silence can teach, how stillness can speak, and how sometimes the softest punishments are the ones that linger the longest.